All right, thanks for having me out here. I'm gonna try to be quick with the front end since we're a little behind. This is a paper kind of stepping back and trying to think about how we think about values and how we study them and connect them to polarization with my co-author Jaehee John. So just to set up the problem a little bit, we see values as something that provides structure to our political belief systems. Maybe we don't have a full-blown ideological viewpoint, as mentioned earlier here, but values can provide some more local structure and create disagreement and thus polarization. But there's been this more recent narrative that maybe it's moral values in particular that create this social divisiveness and polarization. Now, in spite of that, we don't really have a lot of direct evidence for that, right? We have a lot of evidence about the moralization of specific attitudes, much less about values. In fact, we tend to just assume, state, well, these are moral values and these are maybe not. And then we just have different frameworks that don't really talk to each other. So what we're going to do here is take a look at 3 different frameworks for thinking about values, try to categorize them in a rough way because there's a lot of content overlap, and then get some systematic empirical evidence as the extent to which people see these values as moral values. And then we're going to take that and feed it into an experimental test to see the extent to which value disagreement contributes to polarization and how that varies across values and whether the moralization of that value can help explain it. And in fact, it does, as you'll see. So just, I know this is kind of a lot, so I'm going to assume a little bit of background here with these value systems. This is our rough approach at kind of categorizing the 21 different values from 3 systems, each in a row. So starting with moral foundations theory, we have our 5 foundations, which are typically studied as values. And so we're lumping these together into 2 types of cooperative values, and we think that morality is fundamentally about cooperation, and these should be moralized. And so we have our universalist or individualizing values here, and then our binding foundations as what we're calling particularist, it's a hard word to say, values that are more about in-group cooperation and in-group norms. The Schwartz's value system has 10 different values organized in 2 dimensions. And those give us full coverage across the board here. We get self-transcendence types of values like universalism falling under our universalist category, our conservation values similar to binding falling under the particularist category. But then we also get some non-cooperative values, not against cooperation, but just not about cooperation, right? So about self-enhancement like achievement, openness, aspects of hedonism, for example, as being non-cooperative. And finally, mainly in political science, we have these political values that don't really come from a clear theory or framework. They're a little more ad hoc, unfortunately, but widely used. And so you can see here we have some very similar content having to do with more universalist values, some of our particularist kind of group binding values, and then 2 that are debatable, but maybe a little more non-cooperative. If you think of individualism and limited government, it's maybe more tied to self-enhancement values, and empirically that tends to be the case. Again, these are rough categorizations, just to kind of guide our thinking here. Okay, so to jump into our data, we were fortunate enough to get funding through tests, so we have a probability-based national sample. And what we did here is, so we took from those 21 values, over 100 value statements that represent them, and then randomly selected 6 of those for each respondent. So we get coverage of all of those value statements and all of those values, but a random subset for each respondent. So for each they rate their agreement with it, and then their moral conviction with kind of an adapted question from Linda Skitka. So we can test the moralization of that. But then we also fed those statements forward into a conjoint experiment, which I'll explain in a minute. Let me start with descriptive statistics. So this is just showing the average level of moral conviction for that value statement. And so this is for the Schwartz values, and you can see they range between a mean of roughly 3 and 4. Nothing really falls below 3. Everyone says everything is at least somewhat moral. But you can see some patterns here in that those more self-oriented values, power, stimulation, achievement, tend to be the least moralized. Kind of the middle values in there tend to be the more particularist values, security and tradition. While at the upper end, we have the universalist values, as we'd expect. Now for our political values, we get kind of high average, relatively speaking, but less variance across values here. Though at the lower end, we do have individualism and limited government, but only slightly lower than the others. Finally, we have moral foundations, which this is the only framework that's explicitly saying these are, uniquely moral values. And on average, they're a bit higher than our others, but they don't seem distinctly different from many of the similar values from Schwartz's values or political values even. So there may not be anything particularly moral about the moral foundations relative to other values studied elsewhere. But again, we see that care and fairness, our more universalist values, tend to be a bit more moralized than the binding values. Okay, so now to our conjoint experiment. What we did is gave people a profile of a hypothetical person, and for each, they got 6 of these profiles, each with one of those 6 value statements that they were randomly assigned to either say, this person agrees or disagrees with this statement that you just rated. And then we also gave them a bunch of background information I'll show you in a minute. Our main 3 outcomes to get at social polarization is just affect, an indicator of social distance, and an indicator of trust in that person. Here's the other information offered in that conjoint. So we're holding a lot else constant, gender, age, race, party ID, etc., and looking at the effects of that value disagreement above and beyond all of that, because this is all fully randomized. I know this is hard to read, but I'll give you the quick takeaway, which is that the effect of value disagreement up at the top is huge, bigger than anything else on there, bigger than the full shift in party ID from shared ID to opposing ID. So value disagreement really contributes to polarization, but this is averaging across all 21 values, all of those value statements. So if we look at the moderating effect at the individual level, the level of moral conviction, we see that that effect of value disagreement gets much larger as moral conviction increases, as you see that as a moral value. And that's consistent across all 3 of our outcomes. But I think to me, what's most interesting is the question of how much, when we put these 2 together, the descriptive evidence on levels of moralization and this effect here, how much difference do we get across values? And so here we aggregate up, and this is showing the treatment effect of value disagreement for each value across levels of value moralization. And the correlation here at the value level is 0.82 or negative 0.82, so really strong relationship here, and that those much more moralized values have a much larger effect on polarization. In fact, going from the minimum to maximum, we roughly triple that effect size. And you can see the patterns here. The values that are most moralized, that are universalist values typically, that lead to the most polarization. Okay, so again, we've kind of had these different frameworks for thinking about values that don't really speak to each other, and we just have assumptions about which are moral and not. So now we finally have some good systematic empirical evidence on this, suggesting that yes, there is meaningful variation, especially within value systems, and that maybe our moral foundations aren't all that uniquely moral compared to some other overlapping content out there. So it'd be great to see more work kind of bridging these. I believe Mark Brandt has a working paper out there on looking at the conceptual overlap between them. But I think, understanding how much that moralization of a value matters can help guide us in the values that could be used to create polarization, that could be used to moralize specific attitudes, kind of structure our research on this. Yeah, that's it.
We have time for a couple of questions. I guess one question
one question I would have to sort of like bring the fourth talk, your talk, and Emily Kubin's talk from the beginning together. Again, thinking about disagreements between different perceptions of what values matter from a kind of a moral foundations theory perspective versus a dyadic harm perspective. Like, how do you see kind of disparities in how people think about where they're seeing the vulnerabilities emerging in the context of the variability across particular values that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I guess in listening, I've been reading some of the dyadic morality theory work lately, and so I guess my question there is, where does that perception of harm or victimhood come from? And so, one argument is that it's the values themselves that shape who we see as victims, and so maybe that victimhood is a later stage in that process. I suspect, Kurt Gray and co-authors would disagree with that, but seems worth investigating.